How should one build in a city when the skies are grey 3/4 of the time? Here were the musings of Edinburgh's most eminent 20th century architect, Basil Spence. Spence's answer to his own question stands along one of the city's central roads, Causeway Side. The road, a historic main thoroughfare into the Scottish capital, became during the interwar period host to a building from a new age of transport, the Southern Motors Garage. The first commission for the promising architects Basil Spence and William Kinnamumph, this bold and unapologetically modern design seeks to catch the eyes of all those who passed it.
Basil Spence is one of the most prominent Scottish modernist architects. Born in 1907, he died in 1976, and certainly in the 1950s and 60s he would have been the most famous architect working in Britain because of the way that he'd won the very prominent competition to design the new Coventry Cathedral at the start of the 1950s.
Though this film will view the building less as a product of a singular and dogmatic modernist architect, but as a product of its time, using the building as a centre point to understand the period in which it was built, the 1930s, and illustrate the decade in a different light to the reductive narratives that depict a dark era in Britain's history. While the interwar years produced radically new ideas and visions for architecture, the vast majority of structures built in Britain during this time took their stylistic cues from the past. Historians such as Stuart Sillars explain the phenomena as a response to the trauma of World War I and the horrifying legacy of machine warfare. Sillars talks of an anxiety for the future and how revivalist architecture was seen as a comfort blanket against Britain's brave new mechanical world. And Edinburgh was no exception. During this period, many of the city's prominent buildings, while having stylistic nuances, tended to reflect strongly the appearance of neighbouring buildings. Garages were a new building typology for the 20th century, designed to sell and store and fix and fill motorcars. And yet, despite servicing a radically modern invention, many, if not nearly all, were built in revivalist styles, from the neo-Georgian to the neoclassical. And even
famously, in England, you find examples of thatched petrol stations offering perhaps a slightly more comforting and familiar image of this building type that perhaps would have played down its radicalism and made it perhaps feel a little less scary.
However, by the beginning of the 1930s, signs of a changing attitude were becoming apparent. Sir Herbert Austin, the owner of Britain's second largest car company, stated in 1933 that the appearance of many buildings of motor traders is not likely to attract sales or service business, or to enhance the reputation of agents themselves. Some of them need a little window dressing, others a charge of dynamite. Spence's Southern Motors fits this change in attitude, with the uncompromising embrace of the international modern style, a decision which signalled a comfort with the modern mechanical world.
So a building which rejects the traditional architectural styles, this much more abstracted form, these large areas of glass, white rendering. It gives a sense of the modernity, the excitement of the car. And that's something that's, I think, picked up particularly well by Spence.
The building does not hide its modernity. Instead, it advertises and shouts about its newness. Though the building's confidence in modernity is far from being skin deep, its cantilevered structure is significant. Formed of reinforced concrete and steel, the design pushed the boundaries of Spence and Kinnamumph's design abilities. But perhaps where the structure is most committed to modern ideas and methods is in its dependence on a hydraulic lift. The building's ground floor was designed to fill and sell cars, while the first floor acted as a space for maintaining and fixing cars. This meant cars had to be taken up to the first floor. However, unlike contemporary buildings which used a ramp, the building relied exclusively upon the new technology of a hydraulic lift, with no ramp included in Spence's design. And it is precisely this unflinching reliance on modern inventions that reflected its full embrace of the modern age.
That the country is facing a set of challenges similar to the 1930s, the so-called Devil's Decade.
The 1930s is often understood as a quite difficult time in history. Obviously, it's a period which for many people was characterised by the aftermath of the stock market crash and the Great Depression.
However, through this building, we see a different picture of a decade that's often cast in a bleak light. The only contemporary images available of the garage are two oil perspectives drawn by Spence in 1933. Created to sell his vision to the client, Spence's drawings depict a vibrant nighttime scene, bathed in electric light and full of movement from pedestrians and motor cars. The scene is lively and exciting. But most importantly, it is at odds with our established impression of the decade, and perhaps an image we would associate with the Roaring Twenties. Spence's scene should rightly be approached with caution, as filming Causeway Side on a Monday evening attests. However, Spence's image does allude to a much better side of the 1930s, one which has been forgotten. What is curious about the garage is perhaps not so much Spence's design, but the owner of the garage itself.
It would certainly be interesting to know what was going through the heads of the people that commissioned Southern Motors. Often in architectural history we don't have insights into what the clients wanted, but they're often really key in shaping the buildings we get as much as the actual named designer.
The client, J.N. Williamson and Sons, however, were not avant-garde members of the city's business and cultural elite, but an expanding family business, with the boldly styled building commissioned as an extension of their existing garage on the street behind. What's more, the garage was commissioned in 1933 and built in 1934, 2 years in which the Depression in Britain peaked. But through this example of a healthy small business in need of expansion, we see a different reality on the ground to the headline narratives. This structure reflected a prosperity in Britain's motor industry, as well as in the wider economy, with the number of cars on Britain's roads doubling from 1 million in 1929 to 2 million by 1939. 1 in 5 households had access to their own private motor car by the eve of war. These impressive figures reflected general strength in Britain's economy, with Britain the largest exporter of cars in the world by the eve of war.
Well, do you like it?
Well, it certainly looks very nice. I think it's lovely.
Though this prosperity was not isolated to the motor industry, with Britain undergoing significant changes in the 1930s, with another example, building, illustrating a changing nation. During the interwar period, many cities in Britain underwent substantial change, with the growth of suburbs fueled by an increasing prosperity and an ever far-reaching and dynamic transportation system.
The story of building in the 30s certainly varies across the country, and there are some places which see particularly big suburban booms. The southeast of England in particular. And in Edinburgh as well, new housing estates built all round the city periphery. So the city expanded quite dramatically, and someone that had perhaps left Edinburgh in 1914, coming back in 1939, would have experienced a city which was very much larger and which would have seemed to have been encroaching onto the countryside in a quite dramatic way.
And structures like the Southern Motors Garage were part of the infrastructure that catered for these expanding cities, servicing the increasingly mobile middle classes. Despite the building's incongruous appearance, Edinburgh's Southern Motors Garage revealed a very typical insight into the period in which it was built. Through looking at structures such as this, we can appreciate the excitement and feelings of optimism in Edinburgh during this period. Yet while comparisons can be drawn between Edinburgh's experience and those of other British cities during the 1930s, the building has to be understood in the context of both a growing middle class and an increasingly wealthy one, and not be seen to mask the hardships faced by many, certainly those in regions of core industries such as coal, steel, cotton and shipbuilding. But structures like this do reveal a forgotten side of the 1930s. It gives us an insight into a period of movement, transition and change, and dismisses the assumptions of a static and stagnant period, reminding us that the everyday experience can often contradict the headlines